Thank you for that introduction. It's great to see all of you. And I'm excited to be in this conversation with you, Jamelle.
Yes, looking forward to it.
We joked that it might be a little like Oprah, but we're going to be in conversation over the course of an hour, and we'll have a little bit of time for Q&A towards the end. So I think to get us started, I know when we talk about repair or reparations, people go immediately down to thinking about a very specific description of what it is, but I wanted to use this conversation to reset a broader idea of what repair might look like, because I think we're trying to create something that we've never actually experienced before. So I thought we could each give our definition for repair, but before we do, I wanted to read this quote as a way to sort of tee up the conversation. So Rabbi Danya Rutenberg wrote this really great book called On Repentance and Repair, and in it she said, we all want that spiritual reset button. We all want the things we have done, the things that stain our hearts, to be bleached, purified. We want to be washed clean. We want atonement. But the only way out is through. And trying to skip to the end without all the work in the middle means that instead of making different choices, we repeat variations on that same crimson harm. So I think in thinking about what repair might mean, what comes to you when you think about that?
First of all, thank you for having me. It's funny, I went to UVA, I live like 5 minutes from here. I've never been in this building in my life. I got here and I was like, where am I? When I think about traditional forms of reparations, what as you said, what people think about when they hear the word, people often think about, they think about money, they think about a particular program, but if you're going to drill down into what I think is the real ask for reparations, it is at its heart sincere acknowledgement, right? It's a recognition that what happened was wrong, what happened was a crime that should not have happened, that people were responsible for it. It wasn't just a force of nature, a thing that happened to happen, but it was a thing that was actively done to people, and they want a recognition of that fact. The money or the policy that might be a symbolic representation of the recognition, but the recognition is the thing. And so when I think about repair, the first thought that comes to mind is exactly this: a not just recognition of the act, but kind of a recognition of the people who were victims of the act are themselves full people, right? Fully recognize the full humanity of the people on the other side. Because it's only at that point, only with that recognition, that anything concrete can happen after that. Anything concrete that is accepted, right, by the people who want the repair. Otherwise, you're not going to get anywhere.
Yeah, and I think I often work with a very similar definition around repair, that I think oftentimes we think of repair as a destination, right, or a single act. I think sometimes when we talk about reparations, it's referred to as a singular act that we do and then we're done. But your definition, and the one that I often use, really relates to the idea of a process, right, and a system of relationships. And I would say, in addition to the acknowledgement, the reckoning, the other thing that I find that's coming up in a lot of the work is the fact that there's so much grief also attached, and so there's almost like a grieving process that needs to be gone through. And I would also say that I think what we maybe are not talking as much about is the idea of getting to a place where we're completely transforming systems so that we do not repeat the harm.
I think that's right. Especially in the context of, we were just talking about urban renewal. Just having a casual conversation with urban renewal as one does, but we were just chatting about it. And in dealing with the fallout from urban renewal decades on, it's not enough to remove the freeways or create an opportunity zone or construct housing or do something like that. You do have to create a process, in this case be a political process, that takes seriously the input of the people in the community, that is like truly democratic, and that those people are given full space to engage in deliberations and engage in the deliberative process that would or could produce something that might represent, in a real way, repair for the damage done in the past. But I think you're absolutely right that it is like very important to center a word I don't particularly like to use all the time, but center process and center the creation of new structures, of new kinds of institutions, of new kinds of processes that really take seriously the idea of kind of a broad and democratic inclusion of everyone involved, and that takes seriously previous and past power imbalances, right? That in one way, shape, or form, maybe even privileged people who are on the losing end of the previous power imbalance. Simply saying, okay, now we have, democratic equality in the presence of, extant power imbalances doesn't really get you all that far. Doesn't really get you where you want to be.
So, and I don't want to go down a political rabbit hole because we could be here all night, but I'm curious how that happens in the context that we're in now. I mean, I was at a conference in St. Paul just this past weekend, and somebody was bringing up this idea, the fierce urgency of now, Ellen Kay's quote. And it strikes me that when we talk about urgency, it is so much, it's not an urgency of repair, actually, and most of the times that it's used, it's an urgency of forgetting, to get past the discomfort of where we are now. And so if we think about the systems that set up these particular, what you're saying we should be moving towards, it doesn't seem like our systems are really set up to support that.
No, I don't think they are. I think, in fact, that Americans, maybe not just Americans, but I'm an American, so that's what I'm gonna focus on. I think Americans are very much allergic to the idea that the past should be dwelled on in some way, shape, or form for trying to forge a present and a future that might have something to do with just the fact that this is a country built on a frontier. It was a country that for a long time, if you were of the right, gender, race, class, you could just pick up and go somewhere else and start anew. You didn't have to look back on your past, and there's this fantasy of always being able to start anew. And I think that runs directly in to this country's history and this country's legacy, and to the people who are still here and still remember it. Often events that weren't all that long ago, and who are still dealing with the fallout from those events. And so thinking in terms of constructing institutions or constructing processes, once you get past this hump of even wanting to recognize and deal with the past, you then have to think about the ways that previously excluded people, like how they were excluded and what that looked like and what they want and what a process, any kind of political process could possibly deliver. I'm not a political theorist by any means, so sort of thinking about or trying to put forth an idea of what a new kind of deliberative process or democratic process might look like is a little bit beyond sort of what my scope. But I think those are the kinds of questions you have to ask. Like, does it, for example, for sake of analogy, we don't, in the United States, when we're thinking about like constitutional change, we don't, the process for that isn't through a legislature, right? Because it's not ordinary politics, it's something that's beyond ordinary politics or above ordinary politics. And so we have constitutional conventions, which are specially crafted for a particular purpose of changing a constitution. We create a new institution to do this specific task, and maybe that's kind of the frame we have to take. What kind of new institutions can we take for a specific task of repair? because it may not happen through ordinary politics for a variety of reasons.
But then that makes me wonder if maybe it also can't happen at the level of the nation or the state, but like actually has to happen locally. So when after the conference finished in St. Paul, I went over to Minneapolis because I had not been there since 2020. And so I went to 38th in Chicago to look at the George Floyd Square and everything that had happened around there. And it was really interesting because, I'm sure many of you have seen the pictures from, immediately after, and those blocks were closed and had become basically a kind of impromptu living memorial where artists and designers had come through and were transforming that environment. And now the city has opened up those roads again, and it was this interesting thing in that if I look at the pictures that I saw immediately after his killing, it felt like it was a collective redesign by the people to create a place of resistance, of anger and grief and mourning. And now it feels like it's a place that's a little bit in between, right? There's a plan that's being developed by the city through a community process to try to figure out what's there next. But it also seems like community members are trying to put a foothold to say that we want this to be developed in a different way. And so I'm curious about this idea of maybe the transformation into a new system we have never seen is going to happen at the local level. And if so, because we're in a school of built environment, how maybe place and the ways we come together in place might shape that.
I mean, I 100% agree with the idea that these sorts of things are going to happen at a local level first. I think it's generally, just historically speaking, that is kind of how larger scale kind of changes happen in the first place. They kind of begin locally. They begin with local experiments, local politics, these sorts of things, and begin to spread and bubble up. But I do think that, yes, any attempt to take repair seriously is going to begin with a particular community and a particular group of people and a particular event. And it's sort of out of trying to negotiate how to deal with that models and ideas will emerge. Questions about what that nest looks like. I'm very good at posing questions in broad outlines, not so much on the particulars, like what form or what shape this might take. But I will say that there are, we are living in a moment where there are increasingly models and attempts of doing this. One of the things I found so interesting over the past 5 years is not just a kind of broader public awareness of so many of the uglier episodes of American history. I was just in Tulsa, Oklahoma, which I'm sure everyone in this room knows about the Tulsa race massacre in 1921. But it is, 10 years ago, people outside of Oklahoma generally didn't know much about it. 20 years ago, it was just a few years removed from the state of Oklahoma's commission investigating it. And so I remember when I was a kid, the John Singleton movie? Yeah, John Singleton movie Rosewood came out in '95 about the Rosewood Massacre in Florida, which happened 2 years after Tulsa. And my dad's actually from that area of Florida, so he was like, oh yeah, I remember hearing about this when I was a kid. But I have a distinct memory of the media around that movie that was sort of this seems outlandish, right? This doesn't seem like a thing that actually happened. And that was generally the kind of the attitude towards stories of these sort of race massacres that happened in the 20th century U.S. But in the last 5 years, that's totally flipped. People know what they are. And in addition to people knowing what they are, there have just been more communities trying to deal with them, trying to find some way to talk about them, to memorialize them. There's a National Memorial for Peace and Justice that's trying to do this with with lynching, but wherever these things have happened, whether it's East St. Louis, or whether it's Elaine, Arkansas, Tulsa, there have been attempts, an active effort to trying to figure out what do we do with the past, and then what do we do with the present and the future as well. And so, in the sense that things are going to be locally, I think if we just like look out to the country, we can see right now like these local attempts to figure something out.
And I think, you know, just to bring it back to the built environment, one of the things that I think is interesting about Tulsa that I didn't know until I was doing some research a while ago is, so the massacre happens, and the community actually comes together to rebuild Black Wall Street, in spite of codes being changed, insurance companies refusing to pay out. They rebuild it, and it's actually thriving until the 1950s and 60s, when it's time to put in some freeways. And, oh, what's the perfect route for a freeway? Right through Black Wall Street. And that's what actually destroys it for good. And what we were talking about just before we started was the fact that, like, many of these highways and freeways are reaching the end of their useful life, and it is time to either invest in renewing or expanding them. And the question is coming up, like, what do we want to do? Do we want to continue this harm that has been done, or do something different? And so you said a few minutes ago that it's not in your scope to say how to do this, but you are good at asking questions. So what questions should we be asking as we think about those kinds of projects, or these kinds of community coming together around memorialization or thinking about what's next?
It's a very good question. You know, I think that, I mean, there's the maybe the top level question of, do we recognize that like a harm was done here, right? It's still not taken for granted amongst the public at large that communities were sort of like intentionally destroyed by building freeways and highways through them. When a few years back, when the Times did the 1619 project, one of the essays was on traffic and was on transportation, and there was like a legit reaction to that essay, sort of like, oh, this is ridiculous. Like, how could this have anything to do with racism? So there's this top level thing of kind of like, in communities where this happened, like, do people actually recognize like what it is that happened? And insofar that they do, I think the next natural question is sort of like, what do not just the people currently living in the vicinity, but sort of the descendants do as well? Because these events, they scattered communities, they broke up communities, and there are, you know, people who may have left but still very much have an attachment to the place. And so who are those people? Where are they? And is there any way we can bring them together to think about this and talk about this in a deliberative and a collective way? This is sort of getting back to this like issue of like new institutions. Like, that's not a thing that is really done. Not speaking to the community presently, that's a thing that's done. But saying, who are the people through time who were affected by this and who may have been scattered by it, maybe children and grandchildren, so on and so forth. Can we rope them into a deliberative community to discuss about what's going to happen in this place? Those are the kinds of, that's where I would begin, just sort of like the beginning of a process of education, but also what does deliberation begin to look like and who is a participant in it?
It's interesting that you should say that. One of the projects that I'm working on now is in Akron, Ohio. And I was hired by the city because there was a highway that, unfamiliar story, was built over the black neighborhood in the 70s. And has reached, parts of it have reached the end of their useful life. And so there's a 30-acre portion that has been decommissioned, and the city wanted to figure out what the community wanted to see there. So I was hired to lead a process. And realized that there was actually really poor record keeping about what was there before, because that's usually a point that I like to start at too. And so had to go and figure out, had to go to the black churches around town, had to go to the senior buildings to find the former residents. And it was interesting because trying to bring them back into the fold to talk about it, that for many of them, they just didn't talk about it for 50 years. That it had been something that had been, it was easier to forget because it was so painful to remember. And so I think as we think about how do we go out and bring these folks together, some of it is like, what are the structures we're creating around grief in our processes? And almost that revisiting some of these original sins requires, I mean, similar to this, in sort of an atonement, but also not only new structures for action, but new structures for processing.
We don't, I think, as a country, do like collective, in like structured grief, you might say, very well. Like it's not something that that happens all that often. When it does, it's usually around sort of specific, discrete events that don't necessarily implicate other Americans, right? We can grieve around September 11th, we can do public grief on September 11th, but public grief, collective grief around, we'll say Tulsa, not so much. And so I think you're right to identify the need for ways of helping victims and people who experience this, helping them grieve. I'm not entirely sure what that even looks like. That feels very difficult.
Trying to figure it
feels
out
very
myself.
difficult to me, right? Yeah, it's like because you can have you can have a commission to investigate. You can take people's testimony and whatnot. You can give people an opportunity to speak for an official record, and that can provide meaning. This is like tangentially related to the subject, but there's a wonderful book on the congressional report into the first Ku Klux Klan in the 1870s, in the early 1870s. And for that report, Congress actually took testimony from victims of the Klan in the South. So freedmen, freed blacks, the whole class. And there's thousands of pages of this testimony, and it's like really powerful to read the testimony of a recently emancipated and enslaved person speaking to Congress. So sort of the act of speaking to this institution and having your words recorded as if they matter, you're a citizen and they matter, is itself kind of an important process. But I'm not sure that that's like the only way we should be thinking about public grief, right? Like not simply in terms of commissions and institutions of that sort.
Yeah, and I would say that there's some of it that also feels like it's a little bit performative, right? Like that someone has to have their grief on display for
Right.
someone else. And I also want to and this is what makes me really interested about all of these reparations efforts that are happening, is that I also think there's a challenge when we only think about it from the victim perspective. I've done a lot of work and research in South Africa, and I was there in 2018, and I was interviewing a researcher who was doing a lot of work in the townships, and he was saying that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was both a national triumph and a national failing. It was a national triumph because perpetrators of crimes were brought to account, but it was a failing because it allowed us, and he meant white South Africans, to be able to say, see, the individuals who did wrong were brought to account, and it sort of left the rest off the hook from interrogating the ways in which just living in the country meant that you were likely inherent in some way complicit with the system, and how the system needed to completely be reworked. And so when I see some of the reparations conversations that we have in this country, it feels like that. And maybe as another example to kind of juxtapose with that, Elgin Cleckley, a professor here, and I took our students to Asheville a couple weeks ago, and we happened to be there when there was a reparations summit, and they had as the keynote speaker the lawyer who represented the Bruce family in Manhattan Beach. So for those of you who are not familiar with the story, in the 1920s, the Bruce family, which we discovered led in particular by Mrs. Bruce, bought a piece of land in Manhattan Beach and created a beach resort for black folks. And it was wildly popular, so therefore it was not something that made the city happy. And so eventually they took the land through eminent domain to create a park. Did not create a park for many years, and actually you cannot create park on sand. Ultimately did, but not on the land that they took from the Bruce. And so a couple of years ago there began to be a process to return the land to the Bruces, the descendants. And so the land was returned. It's the first example of, I think, land going back that was taken through that process. And then a year or two later, the Bruce descendants sold it back for like $20 million. And I remember reading an article at the time, and the lawyer brought this back up, that the same time that Willow Bruce was getting started was roughly the same time that Conrad Hilton was getting started. And so if you think of those two trajectories, and part of why they sold the land back is all the things they would have to do to turn it into development, to make it a useful land. It's easier for them to take money. So I'm just thinking about these systems that don't change, and the ways in which we don't actually have everybody participating in this conversation of what repair is. And I guess that's not really a question, but I'm just sort of like trying to wrestle with these different things.
I'm actually thinking. I don't have so, like my thought. Just when I guess I'll go to the truth and reconciliation note. It's. I guess I'll make a meta observation based on that. It's. I think that critique of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission rings true, because Americans are also very inclined to want to point to specific individuals and say, well, those individuals are responsible for the thing, and aren't as interested in asking larger questions about the institutions under which those individuals live, or what are the bases for those institutions, the logics of those institutions. But also, just the idea, it's funny, like, with any kind of reparations claim, you're ultimately making a claim on the state, or whatever the governmental entity is. You're making a claim on the city, you're making a claim on the state, as in state of Virginia, you're making a claim on the federal government, and you're saying that you, in your view, this entity did not do its job, or was actively complicit, or actively did a thing that should not have been done, and thus needs to engage in repair and recompense. And so often that point is raised to kind of deflect the response, usually to question the reparations. It's like, well, I didn't do it, right? Like, it wasn't me who did it. It's like, no, of course it wasn't you. It was the state. But then you run into this thing, right? Like, well, we're implicated in the state. Like, the thing about a ostensibly self-governing society is that you can't actually just say, well, that's not me, that's not us. No, it very much is. Like, this is a system based in popular sovereignty. Like, it is us on some level. And so how do you integrate that into a process? The recognition that even someone who was not directly involved, even someone who may have been born well after, just by virtue of being a member of the society, inherits at least some responsibility. Maybe not blame, maybe not guilt, but responsibility. And how do you cultivate that sense, but also like integrate it into a process? I don't particularly know, but I think that's like the real challenge. It's sort of like a bit of a paradox of the thing. It's like we're not necessarily
asking someone born, 50 years after an event to take personal responsibility, unless they're like actively involved in some kind of recapitulation of the injustice, right? Injustice happened, it's in the past, but the state's still responsible, and by virtue of our political arrangement, we thus are also bear some responsibility. Like, how do you tackle that?
And it feels like then so much of we're someone came tonight hoping that we would give an answer to what repair or reparations looks like. I'm sorry, you're going to be sorely disappointed because in some ways we have more questions than not, but I think that's part of the thing we need to do, that if we're not talking about it, that it's not like it gets fixed regardless.
Right.
So I'm curious about this responsibility piece because I'm taking stock of the fact that we are sitting at the University of Virginia. We are in Charlottesville, which is, I thought I saw him earlier, Jordy Yeager and Dr. Andrea Douglas had shown me a map last week that kind of just mapped out all the different plantations that ended up forming Charlottesville. So inherently we are sitting on land that is problematic in some ways. And so what is our responsibility of existing in this place?
I mean, my thought as someone who lives here is very much that we have a collective responsibility to sort of deal with the results of injustice and wrong done to the generations of people who have lived here. I ride my bike everywhere, and it's easy to bike around Charlottesville and see physically the results of dispossession and disinvestment and destruction of communities. And you can't live here and sit back and say, well, I bear no responsibility for that. You do, as a member of this community. We bear responsibilities for trying to make it right as best as we can. And that might mean, the city's going through this process of updating its zoning code. And it's sometimes talked about explicitly, not always, but sort of that process is very much about sort of what is our collective responsibility to past injustices done through building and real estate and the construction of neighborhoods and the destruction of neighborhoods. What do we owe, not just people currently living here who are, who the destruction of the past isn't a living memory for them. It's not like it happened 100 years ago. They very much remember what happened. But then also their children and grandchildren, so that they can have opportunity, and then broadly sort of everyone living in the community who is disadvantaged by its inequality and its forms of injustice that continue to be recapitulated. What do we do for them going forward? How do we build a process that includes them going forward? So I think Charlottesville is sort of the most fitting place to have this kind of conversation and ask kind of questions, and especially since they're, in my observation, even still, we're about 6 years removed from it, but there still seems to be appetite for having these kind of conversations, given the events that happened here 6 summers ago. That for all this tragedy, that event did, I think, make clear in this very dramatic way the extent to which this is not some sort of quaint little paradise, which I think is a view that is still in currency.
Keeping that in mind, I think what's interesting, if I think about Charlottesville, I think about Minneapolis, or even Akron, where last summer there was the police killing of Jalen Walker, right, which ushered in a whole thing, is that on the one hand we have these elements that are crisis, right, and cause us to pay attention, but they're actually overlapped on something that has been embedded into the landscape for generations at this point. And it goes back to that urgency question, right? Like, I think, how do we balance the, let's say, the pragmatic decision of, I want to respond to this thing now, people are hurting, I want to do something around it, with actually, you know, I think just based on the fact that we're like, we probably have more questions than answers at this phase. We're trying to create something we've never seen before, and it will take time. It may even take generations, and those are two completely different timescales. So how do we make and evaluate decisions we may need to make now with the fact that transforming our society to have this collective responsibility is actually a much longer time cycle?
I mean, I think maybe the thing that kind of bridges the two, because often in the immediate wake of these kind of crises, there are people pointing out very, very quickly, like, listen, this reflects, this represents, this grows out of, this is a consequence of like long-standing things happening in this place that is very often acknowledged immediately, and so maybe not acknowledged, pointed out immediately. So maybe the way you bridge kind of like something needs to be done in the moment, but also this is a longer process, is first saying like, let's try to do no harm here, right? Like, let's try not to take any actions, and I've used the word a couple of times now, that recapitulate both the thing that just immediately happened, but also the historic harms and the justice that grows out of. Let's not do anything that reinforces that, precisely because we have to have this longer project of like looking to our past and also to our future for trying to repair and do something lasting and new.
And I wonder then within that, in the do no harm, I don't know, it's just interesting because it feels like we would have to then get to a place where we all collectively are more aware of the harms that we cause. And I guess I'm curious if you have thoughts of how we can do that.
Yeah.
I'm only good at asking really big, complicated questions.
I mean, there's obviously a role for, right, like people like myself who write and who write about these kinds of issues on occasion, and who have platforms with which to do it. I think this is, I mean, it's sort of all of this as a piece, right? Like, this is where processes of community deliberation and, you know, community, you know, self-exploration, I don't know, communities kind of like confronting themselves with what happened in their past, sort of like collectively talking about it. That's sort of what that process, or what those processes are for, kind of like helping a community collectively to understand and maybe get on something like one page about what happened. That necessarily isn't, like, it's very difficult to get like 4 people on one page, 3 even, much less an entire community. But sort of, you know, I'm a big believer in the deliberative process. I think that through sort of like meeting your fellow citizens as equals in kind of like a structured context, you can come to, if not greater consensus necessarily, but like at least greater understandings. When people feel that they have been heard, I think they're willing to grant understanding. And that's, I think, one of the ways which you can begin to put a community closer to something on the same page, in addition to, you know, the work of people typing on their keyboards in their homes.
Yeah, and you know, the thing is interesting that I think sometimes we also run away from conflict. I will often, if I'm in a room full of architects, ask, like, how many of you have actually attended regularly amazing public meetings, and it's crickets, right? Because we're so used to the yelling that occurs at these meetings. You mentioned it in your introduction, right? And I think we run away from conflict many times because it is seen as something that is actually quite bad. And I think the thing that I would say feels like a partner to your description of a deliberative process is we need to do a better job of creating space in which conflict can exist. Not just for the sake of conflict, but because unless we can talk about the hard things, we can't move forward to this destination that we are talking about. And so, as I am also conscious that there's a bunch of students in the room, I think as we think about the processes that may be needed to develop the designs that we're working on, I think the idea of a beautiful community meeting where everything's great and rainbows and unicorns is actually not the goal we should perhaps be shooting for. We should be shooting for something, I should not be shooting, we should be aiming for something that is like, how are we framing spaces in which folks can come together in deliberation, and if there is conflict, it is a productive conflict that is allowing us to work through some of these complicated issues.
Yeah, I think that's right. That's that's like the one thing I would add, that like it's so important for conflict to be expressed in some sort of structured way, not simply, you don't want people just like yelling at people, or if you do, or if people are yelling at people, there needs to be some way to channel that yelling into something that can be constructive in the end. I'm not going to say no one's going to yell. Yelling happens, but you can have constructive yelling, you can have non-constructive yelling.
Well, I feel like this is the point where must insert like my favorite poem, which is a one-line poem from Nayyir Wahid, that is, anger is grief that has been silent for too long. And so I think oftentimes at these community meetings, especially when we're seeing community members kind of come at, it is this grief of not being listened to and not knowing if this is the only time that you're going to get heard. And I think sometimes what I see happen is that those folks get dismissed from the process because they are seen as counterproductive to the work that needs to move forward. And so, you know, I would also love not to have anger at these meetings, but I'm also wanting to just caution that maybe we also need containers that support, it goes back to that grief container, right? Like to support it so that even if that's the place you're coming from, you can engage this in a way that you don't get excommunicated from the process because your grief is so outsized for very good reasons that it is hard for you to engage in the starting point of where things are set up.
Right, and I think along those lines, it's important to take seriously people's feelings of dispossession, of not being listened to. One of the things that I think is like quite striking about American society is like we call ourselves a democracy, but there are so many areas of our lives where things are not democratic at all, where no one really cares what you think, no one really cares what you have to say. You can just think of the workplace, where there's a place that for most Americans, the workplace is a place where, you know, if you're lucky, you have a little bit of autonomy in how you do your job. If you're lucky, you get able to give input to how you do your job. For most people, there's not much democracy in your workplace. Not much democracy in very many places. And when it comes to constructing spaces and communities, I think that has to be a place where like democracy is taken very seriously, and not simply democracy in like in voting, but really democracy in terms of deliberation, in terms of everyone, every person involved being seen as someone whose judgment is worth taking seriously. This is a little random digression. Like the historical origins of counting votes, you know, we don't really think about counting votes having an historical origin, but it does. In the pre-classical period of Greek democracy, things were kind of just done by consent, sort of unanimous consent, and maybe if someone, you know, objected, you deal with the objection, but lots of unanimous consent. There was no thought that you had to count anything. But there comes a point where people want to really know the positions of elders, or elders working in specific contexts and councils. People want to know specifically what they think. And kind of like vote counting comes out of that.
saying I want to count your vote is another way of saying your specific thing that you have to say, I want to hear and I think is important. And I think that element of voting is something we lose. It's sort of like we count individually because we are individually important and we're individually equal. And I think in all of our endeavors, we have to take that seriously, but like especially when it comes to constructing our environment around us.
So I want to open it up for questions, but before I do, I think my last question is just knowing that we have quite a few reparations processes that are afoot, some that are state level like California, others that are city level like Evanston and Asheville. What is your opinion of them? Are they something that can actually work? I'm particularly fascinated that as they try to get to a place that like feels somewhere workable, we are seeing everything from the cash transaction to housing policy or housing loans and relief. So I think as it relates to us being in a school of the built environment, land is being used a lot, as of which, 40 acres and a mule kind of connects to that. But yeah, I'm curious just to get your thoughts on, are any of the processes we're attempting in the right direction, or is there a way that we need to pivot to actually address some of the topics around repair that we talked about this evening?
Yeah, I honestly do not know enough about these individual things to be able to make any judgment on where they should go. But I will say, as someone sort of engaged in public discourse, there remains a broad skepticism of even like the legitimacy of reparations. I think it's for as much as I think it's accepted straightforwardly among people, particular political persuasion, for a lot of folks, it sort of seems ridiculous. And I think that to the extent that these attempts, experiments at reparations can be successful, can be talked about, to the extent that the participants can speak about them, I think that they're important for kind of inculcating the idea amongst the broader public that this is a completely legitimate enterprise. It's not something to be dismissed out of hand. It is something to take very seriously. Because even if you, as many people do, reject the idea of reparations for broad historical tragedies, there are still small historical tragedies, smaller events that are not small for the people who experience them, and which still have effects today, and for which people or institutions can still be held responsible, if not for the event, then at least for its effect. And so I think inculcating that idea as much as possible is an important task, and that these reparations efforts are an important part of that.
Yeah, and I think maybe my one addition to that would be that I think sometimes we get so consumed, and I'm all about a full acknowledgement of the past, but sometimes we set up these processes to acknowledge the past, and then, as I said, continue the harm moving forward. And so I would also say that I think that every time a new law or new policy is being developed that somehow might impact some of these historically impacted populations, that it's also incumbent on us to approach it with a reparative manner, right? Like both, it's not like we're stopping and saying we're not developing anything moving forward. We're doing that while also doing these processes. And so if it's not that like, oh, let's wait till we finish that reparations commission before we start like actually acting like we should be in a reparative frame, like those two things have to go together.